What happens when a man who can control empires and command boardrooms is completely powerless in front of his own 6-year-old son? Damian Blackwood, a billionaire CEO haunted by tragedy, believed money could solve any problem. But it couldn't buy him a single word from his autistic, nonverbal son, Leo. He was losing hope, trapped in a world of silent grief. Then one chaotic afternoon in a simple Italian diner, a struggling waitress named Clara Evans did the impossible. She broke through the silence, not with wealth or power, but with something far more potent. This is the story of how an ordinary woman changed an extraordinary family, and how a moment of simple kindness unleashed a storm of secrets, betrayal, and a love no one saw coming. Stay with us. The air in Damian Blackwood's world was sterile and temperature-controlled. It was the recycled air of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, the filtered air of his Maybach, and the oppressive, silent air of his corner office at Blackwood Enterprises. He was a master of this universe, a man who sculpted skylines and moved markets with a single phone call. Yet every day at 5:01 p.m., he entered a world he could not control, a world contained within the small frame of his 6-year-old son, Leo. Leo lived behind a wall of glass Damian couldn't shatter. Since his wife Isabella's death 4 years ago, the boy had retreated into a profound silence. The official diagnosis was autism spectrum disorder, but to Damian, it was a lock without a key. He had hired the best therapists, the most renowned specialists, and the most expensive nannies. They came with their charts and their theories, their promises of breakthroughs, and they all left, defeated by the same gentle, unbreachable silence. This Tuesday was particularly bad. The nanny had called in sick, and an urgent meeting had been canceled, leaving Damian alone with his son and a gaping, unstructured afternoon. He decided in a rare, ill-advised moment of spontaneity to take Leo for an early dinner. He chose Gina's Trattoria, a small, unassuming restaurant in Greenwich Village that Isabella had once loved for its authentic chaos and the smell of garlic and oregano that clung to the air. He thought foolishly that a memory of her might spark something in the boy. He was wrong. The moment they stepped inside, Leo's world tilted. The clatter of plates was a physical assault. The boisterous laughter from a nearby table was like shattering glass. The overlapping conversations were a tidal wave of noise. Leo's small hands flew to his ears, his body rigid. Damian, accustomed to commanding silence with a mere glance, felt his usual authority evaporate. "It's okay, Leo. We'll just get a quiet booth," he said, his voice tight with a familiar mix of love and frustration. They were seated in a corner, but the corner wasn't quiet enough. The waitress, a harried woman in her 50s, approached with a chipper. "What can I get for you folks today?" Her voice, meant to be friendly, was another sharp edge in Leo's sensory nightmare. Leo began to rock, a low hum vibrating in his chest. It was the prelude to a storm. Damian ordered pasta for them both, quickly, hoping the food would provide a distraction. But it was too late. The hum escalated into a keen, a high-pitched cry of pure distress that cut through the restaurant's cheerful din. Heads turned. Diners exchanged annoyed glances. A baby at another table began to cry in response. Damian's face, usually a mask of cool indifference, flushed with a hot, shameful panic. "Leo, stop it. Please, son. Use your words," he pleaded, knowing the words wouldn't come. He tried to hold Leo's hands, but the boy flinched away, his body coiling like a spring. The pasta arrived. The waitress placed the plate of penne with marinara sauce in front of Leo. The texture was wrong. The sauce was too red, too lumpy. The smell was too strong. The storm broke. Leo let out a scream that was pure, primal anguish. He swiped the plate from the table, sending it crashing to the floor in a sickening explosion of ceramic and red sauce. The entire restaurant fell silent. Every eye was on them. Damian felt like he was drowning, the stares of strangers pressing down on him, suffocating him. He saw pity, annoyance, and judgment in their faces. He was Damian Blackwood, a titan of industry, and he couldn't control his own child. The failure was a physical weight on his chest. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, fumbling for his wallet. "We'll go. I'll pay for everything." As he tried to scoop a thrashing, screaming Leo from the booth, a calm voice cut through the chaos. "Excuse me, sir. Maybe I can help." He looked up. A young woman in a waitress's apron, not the one who had served them, was standing there. She couldn't have been more than 25. She had warm, intelligent eyes and a cascade of chestnut hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Her name tag read Clara. "There's nothing you can do," Damien said, his voice clipped and harsh. Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes weren't on him. They were on Leo, and her expression held none of the pity or judgment he saw everywhere else. It held understanding. "He's overwhelmed," she said softly, her voice a low, soothing murmur, a stark contrast to the cacophony. "Too much noise. Too many smells. Can I try something?" Damien was about to refuse, to gather his broken son and his broken pride and flee. But something in her quiet confidence made him pause. He was desperate. He nodded, a single sharp jerk of his head. Clara knelt, not getting too close to Leo, respecting his space. She didn't look at him directly at first, instead focusing on a small, smooth gray stone he had pulled from his pocket and was clutching in his white-knuckled fist. "That's a beautiful stone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Very smooth. I bet it feels nice and cool in your hand." Leo's screams subsided into ragged, hiccuping sobs. He was still trembling, but he stopped thrashing. His wide, terrified eyes flickered towards her. Clara reached into her own apron pocket and pulled out a set of 3 forks. She began to tap them gently on the wooden table, creating a soft, rhythmic pattern. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. It was quiet, predictable, ordered. Leo's eyes fixated on the forks. His breathing began to even out. The tension in his small shoulders lessened. Clara noticed the untouched bread basket on the table. She took a small, soft piece from the inside, avoiding the crust. She ignored the spilled marinara on the floor and focused only on the task at hand. She held the piece of bread in her palm. "Sometimes," she said, still in that hypnotic, gentle tone, "when the world is too loud, something simple helps. Something soft." She didn't try to hand it to him. Instead, she broke off a minuscule crumb and placed it on the table, halfway between them. Leo watched, his gaze intense. After a long moment, his small hand uncurled, and a single finger reached out, tentatively touching the crumb. He didn't eat it, but he touched it. It was a connection, a bridge. Clara then took a slightly larger piece and, moving with infinite slowness, lifted it towards his mouth. She didn't try to force it. She just held it there, an offering. His eyes darted from the bread to her face and back again. He saw no demands in her eyes, only a quiet patience. And then, the miracle happened. Leo leaned forward, his lips parting, and gently took the piece of bread from her fingers. He chewed slowly, methodically. The storm had passed. The restaurant was still quiet, but the silence was different now. It was filled with awe. Damien Blackwood stood frozen, watching this stranger do what legions of experts could not. She hadn't used charts or theories. She had used intuition, patience, and a piece of bread. She had seen not a disorder, but a boy. She had quieted a storm that had been raging for 4 years. In that moment, watching the waitress feed his son, Damien felt something he hadn't felt since Isabella died, a sliver of impossible, terrifying hope. And he knew, with the unshakable certainty that had built his empire, that he could not let this woman walk away. The minutes that followed felt suspended in time. Clara continued her quiet work, offering Leo tiny pieces of bread, which he accepted with a solemnity that was achingly familiar to Damien. She hummed a low, tuneless melody, a sound so soft it was more of a vibration in the air. The other diners, one by one, returned to their meals, a respectful hush settling over the corner of the restaurant. Damien finally moved, sinking back into the booth. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the calm that had descended. He watched Clara, really watched her. She wasn't just being kind, she was being skillful. Every move was deliberate, non-threatening. She understood Leo's need for space, his language of silence. She spoke it fluently. The restaurant manager, a portly man named Mr. Sal, rushed over, his face a mixture of apology and anxiety. "Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry for the disturbance. Is everything all right? We can—" "Everything is fine," Damien cut him off, his voice hoarse. He didn't take his eyes off Clara and Leo. "Bring the check, and get me this young woman's name." Clara Evans, sir, Mr. Sal provided quickly. She's one of our best. Is there a problem? Quite the opposite, Damien murmured. When Leo had calmly eaten a whole piece of bread, Clara slowly stood up, giving Damien a small, hesitant smile. He's calmer now. I should get back to my tables. Wait, Damien said, his voice regaining its usual command. Don't go anywhere. He settled the bill, leaving a tip so large it made Mr. Sal's eyes bulge. Then he turned his full, undivided attention to Clara, who stood nervously wiping her hands on her apron. In the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen entrance, he could see the faint shadows of exhaustion under her eyes. Her uniform was neat but worn. This was a woman who worked hard for every dollar. I need to speak with you, he said. It wasn't a request. They stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city was thrumming with life, but for the first time, Damien felt a pocket of stillness around him. Leo was holding his hand, a rare and precious occurrence, his other hand still clutching the gray stone. Ms. Evans, Damien began, his tone shifting into the one he used for high-stakes negotiations. I have a proposition for you. I am prepared to offer you a job. Clara looked bewildered. A job? Sir, I have a job. You wait tables. I saw what you did in there. That was not the work of a waitress. That was something else. My son Leo is autistic. He is nonverbal. I employ a team of specialists who cost more per hour than you likely make in a week, and none of them have ever connected with him the way you just did in 5 minutes. The words tumbled out, stark and factual. He was laying out the parameters of a deal. Clara bristled slightly at his blunt assessment of her finances, but her focus remained on the boy. She glanced down at Leo, who was watching the passing taxis with a quiet intensity. He was just scared, she said softly. Anyone with a little patience could have. No, Damien interrupted. They couldn't. I couldn't. What do you want, Ms. Evans? To finish a degree? To pay off debt? Name a price. I want you to work for me, as Leo's full-time caregiver. Clara was stunned into silence. She was, in fact, drowning. She was in the 3rd year of her master's in child psychology, specializing in neurodevelopmental disorders. The irony was crushing. She studied all day how to help children like Leo, then worked all night serving pasta to pay for the tuition that was bearing her in debt. Her passion was a luxury she paid for with aching feet and sleepless nights. The job Damien Blackwood was offering was not just a lifeline. It was a dream. But the way he offered it, like he was acquiring a new asset for his portfolio, set her teeth on edge. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. Your son isn't a problem to be solved or a company to be managed. He's a little boy who experiences the world differently. Damien's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being lectured, especially not by a waitress on a sidewalk. I am aware of that. I am his father. Then you should know that what he needs isn't a new employee. He needs connection, consistency, trust. That can't be bought with a salary. A flicker of respect entered his cold gray eyes. She wasn't intimidated. Fine, he said. Consider the salary compensation for your time. What you provide will be up to you. I will pay you triple what you make here. Quadruple. The number that formed in her head was dizzying. It would mean no more double shifts. It would mean a new laptop, books that weren't from the library, maybe even an apartment that didn't have a leaky faucet. It would mean she could focus entirely on her studies and on helping this beautiful, silent little boy. But she saw the trap. To him, she was a tool, a new, promising therapy. If she failed, she'd be discarded like the others. She had to set the terms. She had to make him see. If I consider this, she said slowly, choosing her words with care. There are conditions, non-negotiable. Damien raised an eyebrow. Go on. First, my methods are my own. No teams of specialists hovering over my shoulder, contradicting my approach unless I ask for a consultation. I build trust with Leo my way. Agreed, he said surprisingly quickly. Second, this is not a 9-to-5 job. His needs won't follow a clock. But I am also a student. I will need protected time for my classes and studies. My education is not optional. We can arrange a schedule. And third, she took a deep breath. This was the most important one. You have to be involved. I'm not a replacement for his father. I can help build the bridge, Mr. Blackwood, but you're the one who has to walk across it. I will require you to spend at least 1 hour with him every evening. No phone, no laptop, just you and your son, with my guidance." Damien stared at her, his expression unreadable. Of all the conditions, this was the one that hit him the hardest. An hour, an entire hour unplugged, with the silence and his own feelings of inadequacy. The specialist had always let him retreat to his study, providing him with written reports of the session's progress. Clara was demanding his presence, his participation in his own son's life. He looked down at Leo, who had let go of his hand and was now tracing the cracks in the pavement with his shoe. He saw the ghost of Isabella in the curve of his cheek, in the dark sweep of his lashes. Guilt, a cold and constant companion, twisted in his gut. For 4 years, he had tried to solve the problem of Leo. He had thrown money, resources, and experts at him, all from a safe distance. This young woman was telling him the solution wasn't a resource to be bought, but a commitment to be made. "Agreed," Damien said, his voice quiet but firm. "All of your conditions are met. When can you start?" Clara felt a dizzying rush of fear and excitement. Her life was about to change irrevocably. "I have to give my 2 weeks' notice to Mr. Sal." "No," Damien said, pulling out his phone. "You'll quit tomorrow. I'll write a check to the restaurant to cover their inconvenience for the next month. My car will pick you up tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Send me your address." It was a whirlwind of command and control, but beneath it, Clara sensed a desperate urgency. He wasn't just hiring an employee, he was grasping at the first real hope he'd had in years. "All right, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. "I'll see you tomorrow." As the sleek black car pulled away, carrying the billionaire and his silent son into the glittering Manhattan night, Clara Evans stood on the sidewalk, the smell of garlic still clinging to her apron. She had just made a deal with one of the most powerful men in New York. She wasn't sure if she had just saved herself or if she had just stepped into a gilded cage. The Blackwood penthouse was less a home and more a monument to absence. Located on the 80th floor of a new, impossibly thin skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows displayed Central Park like a carefully curated painting. The furniture was minimalist, all sharp angles and unforgiving surfaces of chrome, glass, and black leather. There were no photographs on the walls, no scattered toys, no clutter of life. The silence here was different from Leo's. It was a heavy, sterile void that seemed to absorb all sound and warmth. When Clara arrived at precisely 9:00 a.m., a severe-looking housekeeper named Mrs. Gable showed her in, her disapproval a palpable force field. "Mr. Blackwood is at the office," Mrs. Gable announced, her voice as starched as her uniform. "Leo is in his playroom. These are the approved dietary guidelines from his nutritionist, his schedule of therapies, which Mr. Blackwood has instructed me you are to disregard for now, and the emergency contact list." She handed Clara a tablet, the cold screen a perfect mirror of the apartment's soullessness. Clara smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. I'd prefer to start by just getting to know Leo." "Where is the playroom?" The playroom was the one area that defied the apartment's aesthetic, yet it was just as heartbreaking. It was filled with every expensive, sensory toy imaginable. Glowing light panels, weighted blankets, elaborate balance beams, and bins of color-coded blocks. It looked like a catalog for a special education supply company. And in the middle of it all sat Leo, alone on a large white rug, meticulously lining up a series of small gray wooden cars. He didn't look up when they entered. "I'll leave you to it," Mrs. Gable sniffed, retreating from the ordered chaos. Clara felt a profound sadness. This room, this boy, was the epicenter of Damien Blackwood's strategy. Overwhelm the problem with resources. But all the toys in the world couldn't buy companionship. She didn't announce her presence. Instead, she sat down on the rug a good 10 feet away from him, crossing her legs and simply observing. She watched the intense focus in his eyes as he nudged a tiny car a millimeter to the left to achieve perfect alignment. She noted the way he tilted his head, listening to a sound she couldn't hear. She was entering his world on his terms. For an hour, she just sat there, breathing quietly. Finally, she took a small, smooth wooden block from a nearby bin, one that was a similar shade of gray to his car's, and placed it on the floor next to her. She didn't push it towards him. She just added it to the landscape. Leo's hands stilled, his head turned, and his dark eyes, so like his father's, assessed her. Then the block. There was no fear this time, only a quiet curiosity. He didn't move towards it, but he had acknowledged her. It was a start. The days fell into a pattern. Mornings were for quiet observation and gentle invitations. Clara learned Leo's rhythms. She discovered he loved the feeling of raw silk, the taste of frozen blueberries, and the low, resonant hum of the dishwasher. He hated the sound of the blender, the smell of perfume, and the texture of wool. She communicated with him not through words, but through shared sensory experiences. She brought in a box of sand, letting him run his fingers through it. She played soft classical music. Debussy, she found, was a favorite. She never forced interaction, but created opportunities for it, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for him to follow if he chose. Damien would come home each evening, a thundercloud of corporate stress trailing behind him. The first night of their agreement, he stood awkwardly in the doorway of the playroom. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice low, as if afraid to break the spell. "You sit," Clara said simply, pointing to a spot on the floor. "And you watch." He sat, stiff and uncomfortable, in his $1,000 suit. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Leo continued to stack blocks, pointedly ignoring his father. Damien's jaw was tight with impatience. Clara could feel his frustration radiating off him. "This is pointless," he finally whispered. "It's only been 20 minutes, she whispered back. "He spent 6 years learning to exist without you in this space. You have to earn his trust." The next night, Damien changed out of his suit and into a simple t-shirt and trousers. It was a small concession, but it felt monumental. He sat on the floor again. This time, Clara gave him a task. "Watch his hands," she instructed. "Notice the pattern he's making with the blue blocks. 3 stacked, 1 to the side. 3 stacked, 1 to the side." Damien watched. For the first time, he wasn't looking at his son's silence as a void, but at his actions as a language. He saw the precision, the focus. He saw intention. A week later, they had their first small victory. Leo was lining up his gray cars. Clara pushed a single car towards the end of his line, adding to it. Leo paused, looked at her, and then nudged her car into perfect alignment with the others. It was a gesture of acceptance, of collaboration. Clara looked at Damien, whose eyes were wide. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. It transformed his severe features, making him look younger, less burdened. He let you join," he breathed. "Now you try," Clara urged. With trembling hands, Damien took a car and, mimicking her exact movements, slowly pushed it towards the line. Leo watched him, his expression unreadable. He looked at the car, then at his father's face. He didn't push it away. He didn't scream. He simply reached out a small hand and adjusted the car, making it part of his perfect, ordered world. Damien's breath hitched. He had just communicated with his son. It was a single, silent gesture, but it was more meaningful than any conversation he'd ever had in a boardroom. He looked at Clara, his eyes shining with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. It was pure gratitude. The atmosphere in the penthouse began to shift. The sterile silence was gradually replaced by the soft notes of Debussy, the quiet rustle of sand, and sometimes a low, happy hum from Leo. Clara started bringing in plants, adding touches of green life to the monochrome apartment. She even convinced Damien to unearth a few framed photos of Isabella, placing one in the living room and one in Leo's bedroom. The more time she spent with Damien during their mandated evening hour, the more she saw beyond the ruthless CEO. She saw a man consumed by a grief so profound he had sealed himself off from the world. He spoke about his wife in clipped, painful sentences, revealing a love that was as deep as his sorrow. One evening, as they watched Leo sleep, Damien turned to her, his voice rough. The specialists always talked about him as a series of deficits: sensory processing disorder, speech delay, social communication impairment. They never once mentioned that he likes the way the moonlight hits the floor. "They were looking at the diagnosis," Clara said softly. "I'm looking at the boy." Damien stared at the photo of Isabella on the nightstand. She would have known what to do. She was warm, like you. She would have known how to reach him. The admission hung in the air, thick with vulnerability and a burgeoning trust. Clara realized her role was becoming far more complex than that of a caregiver. She wasn't just building a bridge to Leo, she was building one to his father too. And she was beginning to fear that walking across it would be just as dangerous for her own heart. The fragile peace that had settled over the Blackwood penthouse was shattered by the arrival of a Category 5 hurricane named Eleanor Blackwood. Damien's mother was a woman carved from ice and old money. She moved with the regal certainty of someone who had never been told no, her presence sucking all the newfound warmth from a room. She arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, dressed in a Chanel suit the color of a stormy sky, her silver hair styled into a perfect, immovable helmet. She found Clara and Leo on the living room floor, not playing with expensive toys but with a simple bowl of water, dropping different leaves into it to see which ones floated. Leo was emitting a series of soft, happy clicks, his version of laughter. Eleanor surveyed the scene, her thin lips pressed into a line of profound disapproval. "Damien," she said, her voice dripping with condescension as her son entered the room. "What is this? I thought you had hired a new caregiver, not a camp counselor." Damien stiffened. "Mother, this is Clara Evans. Clara, my mother, Eleanor Blackwood." Clara stood, wiping her damp hands on her jeans. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanor's cold eyes swept over Clara's simple attire, jeans and a soft-knit sweater, as if she were something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "Ms. Evans, my son pays you a considerable sum, I'm sure. I expected to see a more structured therapeutic approach." "Leo is responding to this approach," Damien said defensively. "He's calmer. He's more engaged." "Engaged with what? Foliage?" Eleanor scoffed. "He needs rigor, discipline. I've taken the liberty of scheduling a consultation with Dr. Alistair Finch from Zurich. He is the world's foremost expert in behavioral modification for children like Leo. He has a private clinic, very exclusive. He can fix this." The phrase "fix this" landed like a blow. Clara saw Leo flinch, as if he understood the intent behind the words, even if he didn't grasp their meaning. "He doesn't need to be fixed, Mrs. Blackwood," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "He needs to be understood." Eleanor arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "And you, with your master's degree from a state university, believe you understand him better than a world-renowned doctor?" Her tone was a weapon, designed to diminish and dismiss. She had clearly had Clara investigated. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Damien, who could stare down hostile corporate raiders without blinking, seemed to shrink under his mother's icy glare. He was caught between the old world of his mother's expectations and the new world of hope Clara was building. "Mother, we can discuss this later," he said, his voice strained. "There is nothing to discuss," Eleanor declared. "I have made the arrangements. Dr. Finch will be here tomorrow. We cannot allow this boy's potential to be squandered by finger painting and puddle gazing." She swept out of the room as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving a chill in her wake. Later that evening, after Leo was asleep, the confrontation Damien had tried to avoid finally erupted. He was pouring himself a scotch, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass held by his unsteady hand. "She means well," he said, not looking at Clara. "Does she?" Clara challenged, her arms crossed. "Or does she see your son as a blemish on the perfect Blackwood family legacy? Something to be fixed so he can be presentable at galas?" Damien winced. "It's not that simple. My mother, she's from a different generation. She believes in institutions, in experts with pedigrees. After Isabella died," he trailed off, the name of his late wife hanging in the air like a ghost. "What about Isabella?" Clara pressed gently. "Do you think she would want Leo sent away to a clinic?" A raw nerve had been touched. Damien slammed the glass down on the marble countertop. "Don't you dare presume to know what my wife would have wanted," he snarled, his grief and guilt manifesting as sudden, white-hot anger. The outburst shocked them both into silence. Clara held her ground, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't afraid of his anger. She was starting to understand that it was just a shield for his pain. He slumped against the counter, the anger draining away, leaving him looking exhausted and broken. Isabella. She was the only one who wasn't afraid. Everyone in my life is afraid of me or wants something from me. My mother wants a perfect heir. My employees want my approval. But Isabella, she just saw me, and she would have seen Leo, really seen him. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a terrible, long-held sorrow. The day she died, it was postpartum complications, an embolism. The doctors said it was rare, unavoidable, but I wasn't there. His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. There was a hostile takeover bid for a rival company, a once-in-a-lifetime deal. She called me from the hospital, said she felt strange, dizzy. I told her the nurses were there, that I was in the middle of the most important call of my career. I told her I'd be there in an hour. He squeezed his eyes shut as if he could block out the memory. By the time I got there, it was too late. I was closing a deal while my wife was dying, and my son was left without a mother. The confession filled the sterile kitchen, raw and agonizing. This was the source of his guilt. This was why he couldn't connect with Leo. The boy was a living, breathing reminder of his greatest failure. He hadn't just lost his wife. He believed he had failed her in her final moments. Damien, Clara said, her voice soft with an empathy that cut through his defenses. She took a step closer. That is a horrible burden to carry, but it wasn't your fault. You didn't know. It doesn't matter, he choked out. I wasn't there. And now my mother wants to send him away, and part of me thinks maybe she's right. Maybe he'd be better off with experts, away from me. Away from this mausoleum. No, Clara said fiercely, her hand instinctively reaching out and covering his on the counter. His hand was cold as stone. Don't you see? Sending him away is the same thing you've been doing all along, keeping him at a distance. He doesn't need Dr. Finch from Zurich. He needs his father. He needs you to be present, right here, right now. He needs you to fight for him. Her touch was like an electric shock. It was the first time they had made physical contact that wasn't accidental. It was a gesture of pure, unvarnished human connection. Damien stared at her hand on his, then slowly raised his tormented eyes to meet hers. He saw no judgment in her gaze, only a deep, profound understanding that mirrored the way she looked at his son. She was not afraid of his grief or his anger. She was willing to stand with him in the wreckage of his past. The appointment with Dr. Finch, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Cancel it. It was a declaration of war against his mother and a declaration of trust in Clara. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time, Damien Blackwood was choosing the fragile, uncertain world of love and connection over the cold, hard certainty of his mother's control. He was choosing to fight, not just for his son, but for himself. The cancellation of Dr. Finch's appointment sent a seismic shock through the Blackwood dynasty. Eleanor called, her voice a frigid torrent of fury and disbelief. Damien, for the first time in his adult life, held his ground against her. He was polite, firm, and immovable. The conversation ended with his mother hanging up on him, a feat no one at Blackwood Enterprises could have imagined possible. The act of defiance, however small, changed Damien. It was as if by protecting the small world Clara was building for Leo, he was also protecting a nascent part of himself. A weight had been lifted. He started coming home earlier, not just for the mandated hour, but because he wanted to. He would sit on the floor, no longer stiff or awkward, and simply be present. The real breakthrough came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The relentless drumming of water against the panoramic windows would have once sent Leo into a spiral of anxiety. But Clara had turned it into a game. She had placed a large metal bowl on the floor, and they were listening to the different sounds a single drop of water made, a soft plink from a short distance, a resonant plonk from higher up. Damien was watching, mesmerized by their simple, focused joy. Leo, completely absorbed, pointed up, then at the bowl, a clear, nonverbal communication. He wanted Damien to make a raindrop. Damien scooped some water into his hand and held it high, letting a single drop fall. Plonk. Leo's face split into a wide, radiant grin. And then he looked directly at Damien, his dark eyes clear and focused, and uttered the first word he had spoken in 4 years. More. The word was quiet, a little raspy from disuse, but it was perfectly formed. It was a request, a connection, a miracle. The world stopped. Damien froze, his hands still dripping. He stared at his son, his heart seizing in his chest. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide with disbelief. She had tears streaming down her face, a silent, joyful affirmation. He spoke, Damien whispered, the words catching in his throat. He did, Clara beamed. He spoke to you. Overcome, Damien knelt in front of his son. More, Leo. You want more? Leo nodded, his eyes bright. More. For the next hour, they were just a father and son, playing in the rain indoors, the single word more passing between them like a sacred vow. It was more than a word. It was an opening, a doorway swinging wide in the glass wall that had separated them for so long. That evening, the apartment was filled with a new kind of energy. It was a giddy, buoyant joy. After Leo was tucked into bed, still clutching the gray stone Clara had first noticed, Damien found her in the living room, gazing out at the glittering, rain-slicked city. I can never repay you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. What you've given me today, what you've given Leo. You're the one he spoke to, Damien, she said softly, turning to face him. You were present. You were there. That's all he's ever wanted. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy. The lines of employer and employee, of caregiver and grieving father, had long since blurred. They were partners in this journey, allies in the fight for Leo's happiness. He saw her not just as a healer for his son, but as a light in his own suffocating darkness. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. Clara, he began, his voice dropping. But whatever he was about to say was cut short by the sharp, angry buzz of the intercom. Mrs. Gable's flustered voice announced, Mr. Blackwood, your mother is in the lobby. She is insistent. The spell was broken. Eleanor Blackwood marched into the apartment moments later, her face a mask of cold fury. She ignored Clara completely, her laser-like focus on her son. I have just come from a lunch with Judge Abernathy, she announced, her voice dangerously calm. He was asking after Leo. I had to explain that you have placed him in the care of an unqualified, sentimental girl and canceled his appointments with actual doctors. It was humiliating. Mother, this is not the time, Damien warned, stepping in front of Clara protectively. It is precisely the time, she snapped. Do you have any idea how this looks? The Blackwood heir being treated with arts and crafts? It's a disgrace. I will not stand by and watch you ruin that boy's future and this family's reputation because you are infatuated with his nanny. The accusation, though venomous, hit dangerously close to the truth that was blooming between them. Clara flushed, but Damien's anger finally boiled over. Enough! He roared, his voice echoing in the vast, silent apartment. It was a sound of primal fury, the roar of a man pushed too far. You will not speak to Clara that way. You will not speak about my son that way. He spoke today, Mother. He said his first word in 4 years. He spoke to me. And it wasn't because of a doctor from Zurich or a behavioral chart. It was because of her, because of patience and kindness and love. Things you wouldn't recognize if they were gift-wrapped in Tiffany's. Eleanor was momentarily stunned into silence by the force of his outburst. This is my son, and this is my home. Damien continued, his voice shaking with rage and conviction. Clara has brought more healing into this home in 2 months than you have in your entire life. Her methods, her presence, are not up for discussion. If you cannot accept that, and if you cannot treat her with the respect she deserves, then you are not welcome here. It was an ultimatum, the final, irreparable severing of his mother's control. Eleanor stared at him, her face pale, her composure finally cracking. She saw not just his defiance, but the woman standing behind him, the source of this newfound strength. Her gaze shifted to Clara, and it was filled with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. You will regret this, she hissed, her voice low and menacing. You have made a very powerful enemy, little girl. Both of you. She turned on her heel and stormed out, the slam of the apartment door reverberating like a gunshot. In the ringing silence, Damien and Clara stood, their hearts pounding. The boundary had been drawn, the line had been crossed. Damien had finally chosen his new family over his old one. But as Clara looked at the fury in Damien's eyes and remembered the chilling threat in his mother's, she knew this was far from over. Eleanor Blackwood was not a woman who accepted defeat. This wasn't the end of the war. It was just the beginning. The aftermath of Eleanor's dramatic exit left a strange calm in its wake. The threat lingered in the air, but the immediate result was a sense of profound intimacy between Damien and Clara. He had defended her, chosen her, and in doing so, had irrevocably bound them together. The last vestiges of their professional relationship dissolved in the heat of that confrontation. A few nights later, Leo was asleep, and a soft quiet had fallen over the penthouse. Damien found Clara in the small library, a room she'd slowly been bringing to life with books on poetry and art, a stark contrast to the shelves of leather-bound business treatises. He didn't speak at first, simply handed her a glass of wine. He stood by the window looking down at the river of lights that was the city at night. "I've never spoken to her like that before," he said quietly. "My entire life, I've either been seeking her approval or avoiding her disappointment." "You were protecting your son," Clara said, her voice gentle, "and you were protecting me." He turned to face her, his expression raw and vulnerable in the dim light. "I was protecting my home. You've made this place a home again, Clara. I had forgotten what that felt like." He walked over to where she was sitting, but instead of taking the adjacent chair, he sank to the floor, leaning against the sofa near her feet. It was a gesture of surrender, of weariness. He looked up at her, his guard completely down. "That night, with Isabella," he began, his voice raspy, "there's more I didn't tell you." Clara waited, her heart aching for the pain she knew was coming. "The call wasn't just a business call," he confessed, his eyes fixed on some distant, painful memory. "It was with my father's old rival, a man named Marcus Thorne. We had been trying to acquire his company for a decade. It was the culmination of my entire career, the deal that would finally make my father's legacy look small in comparison. I was obsessed. I had been working 20-hour days for months. Isabella begged me to slow down, to be present for the last weeks of her pregnancy. She said she was scared, that she felt alone." He took a shaky breath. "When she called from the hospital, I heard the fear in her voice. But all I could hear louder was Thorne's voice on the other end of the line, about to capitulate. I made a choice. In that split second, I chose the deal over my wife's fear. I thought I'd have a lifetime to make it up to her." He finally looked at Clara, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "My mother knows this. She doesn't know the specifics, but she knows I was on a call, that I was closing the Thorne deal when Isabella died. In her mind, my ambition, the very thing she and my father cultivated in me, is what killed her, and she's never forgiven me. She thinks I'm incapable of putting family first, and until recently, she was right." This was the heart of it all, the festering wound at the center of his soul. His mother's disapproval wasn't just about Leo's condition. It was a constant, piercing reminder of Damien's most profound failure. Clara slid from the chair to the floor, sitting in front of him, so their knees were almost touching. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy forgiveness. She simply offered her presence. "You have been carrying an impossible weight," she said, her voice a soothing balm. "You have been punishing yourself for years, Damien. You built these glass walls around you and Leo because you felt you didn't deserve warmth or happiness. You thought you deserved the silence." He let out a ragged sob, the sound torn from the deepest part of him. It was the sound of 4 years of repressed grief finally breaking free. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. Instinctively, Clara reached out, her hands covering his. She gently pulled them away from his face, forcing him to look at her. "What happened was a tragedy," she said, her eyes locked with his. "A terrible, senseless tragedy. It was not a punishment. You have to stop punishing yourself. Leo needs you. Not the CEO, not the ghost of your past. He needs his father. The man who makes raindrops in a bowl, The man who learns the language of gray cars. That's the man Isabella fell in love with. And he's still in there. His tears fell freely now, hot and silent. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, into her strength. In this quiet, book-filled room, high above the sleeping city, he finally allowed himself to grieve, to be seen in his brokenness, and to be met not with judgment, but with a profound and unconditional empathy. The distance between them vanished, consumed by the raw emotion of the moment. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning. It wasn't the touch of an employer or a friend. It was something more. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Her name was a prayer, a plea. She didn't need words. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her own eyes shimmering with tears. The connection that had been simmering for weeks, built on shared glances over Leo's sleeping form, whispered conversations in the quiet of the night, and a mutual battle for the soul of a little boy, finally ignited. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of release. It was tender and heartbreakingly soft. It was a kiss of gratitude, of sorrow, of hope. It tasted of salt and wine and 4 years of unspoken grief. It was an acknowledgement of everything they had been through and a promise of everything they could become. When they broke apart, the air was different. The secrets were unveiled. The ghosts had been faced. They were no longer just a billionaire and a nanny. They were two wounded people who had found solace and strength in each other. But as Clara rested her head against his shoulder, a sense of foreboding trickled through her. She thought of Eleanor's final, venomous threat. A woman like that, armed with the knowledge of Damien's deepest shame and fueled by a new jealous hatred, would not simply fade away. She would not allow them this happiness. She would aim to destroy it, and she would use the one weapon she knew would hurt them most: Leo. The fragile peace shattered when 2 social workers from the Administration for Children's Services appeared at their door. They were responding to a formal complaint filed by Eleanor, alleging that Clara was an unqualified caregiver, the home environment was unstable due to an inappropriate relationship, and Damien was an emotionally unfit father. The allegations were a dagger to the heart of their new family, and Leo, sensing the tension, retreated into a complete, heartbreaking silence. Seeing Damien crumble with the fear of losing his son, Clara refused to let Eleanor win. "She's fighting us in the dark," Clara declared. "We will fight her in the light." Her audacious plan was to seize the narrative. Damien arranged an exclusive televised interview with a respected journalist. In front of millions, Damien laid his soul bare. He spoke of his grief over Isabella, his guilt, and his failings as a father. He then introduced Clara, not as an employee, but as the woman who saved them. He took her hand, declaring, "Clara Evans saved my son, and in doing so, she saved me. She is my partner." The interview was a bombshell, recasting their story as one of redemption and love. At the emergency guardianship hearing a week later, Eleanor's case crumbled. The interview had swayed opinion, and the testimony of one of the social workers who stated under oath, "What I saw was a family," was the final blow. The judge dismissed Eleanor's petition, calling it vindictive and frivolous. Outside the courthouse, free and victorious, Damien kissed Clara, a triumphant public declaration. Leo, holding both their hands, looked up at them and said a single perfect word: home. They had faced the storm together and emerged not just intact, but unbreakable. And so the sterile penthouse high above the city became a true home, filled not with silence, but with the sounds of a little boy's laughter, the notes of a piano, and the easy, loving conversation of 2 people who found each other in the most unexpected of ways. Damien Blackwood, the billionaire who had everything, finally learned that his greatest wealth wasn't in his bank account, but in the small, warm hand of his son and the loving gaze of the woman who taught him how to be a father. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the simple, powerful act of seeing another person, truly seeing them, and offering a hand of kindness. If this story of love, loss, and the incredible power of acceptance touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What was your favorite moment? Every like, share, and subscription helps us bring more stories like this to you. Don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.